How do we determine the ideal focus for participants leaving a workshop? Because here's the thing, if you're good at what you do, you inspire people in the room. They get excited, they get educated, they've got all the knowledge fresh in their brain. They've probably got a desire to go out and change something when they leave the session. So how do you direct that? How do you ensure that what they are focused on leaving the session is likely to manifest, is likely to be realized as a lasting behavior change? Well, in the work that we've been doing at Actionable over the last 15 years, we've been really diving into understanding what types of commitments people make when they leave the session. For context, there's action-focused, task-focused commitments, and then there's behavioral-focused commitments. And subject for another video, we know that behavior-focused commitments are the ones that lead to the most lasting change, which sounds great, but there is nuance within what people are committing to behaviorally when they leave a session. And so I've attempted to map this out here so you get a sense of what we're actually talking about. I found that there's value in looking at the type of behavior that someone's committing to leaving a session through the lens of two factors. One is the stakes. Is this high stakes or low stakes, as we'll get into in just a second. And then the second is, what about meaning? For them personally, how much meaning does this have? i.e., how much do they see their own lives improving, the lives of the people they care about improving, if they were to realize this behavior change? And so we can plot this on a high-low axis for each of these. Now, in the case of stakes, I've got high on the left and low on the right, which I'll show you why in just a second. Meaning has a more traditional high at the top and low at the bottom. So if you think about this, right, you've got people in the session being inspired, and then before they leave the room, you get them to commit to a thing, something behavioral that they're going to do differently. And we can largely plot these into one of four quadrants. The first quadrant to take a look at here that's really not helpful is when we've got people in a high stakes, low meaning commitment. In other words, they have been basically told to focus on practicing something that probably has, material impact for them. Could be, maybe it's even their employment. Maybe this is a remedial program, or maybe it's the understanding that I have to develop these skills in order to move to the next level. If the meaning is low for me, i.e. I don't want to do that, it feels out of alignment for me, it's not the focus for me, then this is directed. And this becomes a trap because this ends up being homework. It becomes something that they're supposed to do. And the likelihood from what we've seen from now about 3 million data points is that the likelihood that they're going to stick with this and actually put it into practice is very, very low. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't focus on high-stake tasks, which we'll talk about in just a sec, but it does mean that we want to ensure that the time in the session is adequate for them to find meaning in the thing. The second area is where it's low stakes, low meaning. Sometimes, I've got this in yellow because sometimes distractions are okay. Sometimes we need something to take a little bit of pressure off, and so working on something that feels kind of novel or fun can be good in the grand scheme of things. But if the purpose of your program is to drive meaningful change, this is not going to do that. This is just a thing that's sort of unrelated to their work, unrelated to something they care about, and doesn't make a material impact in the business itself. Now, here's where things get really interesting, because you would think that people committing to behavioral shifts that can be applied in high stakes, high meaning environments are ideal. But what we've found is that these are largely situational. Meaning, they have learned some, let's use some examples. They've learned some facilitation skills for guiding the next board meeting. They've learned how to have that tenuous conversation with an employee that they've had issues with in the past. DEI was very popular for this, where the behaviors were around when you see something, say something sort of thing, right? And all of that's well intended, but the problem with situational commitments is that you don't have a chance to practice them regularly. Most high stakes commitments for most people are things that happen infrequently. The challenge with this is that when you go to practice this in those high stakes moments, you're typically dealing with a lot of other emotions. High stake moments typically come with elevation in cortisol levels, comes with that sort of tunnel vision of fight or flight, and your body's natural instinct is to fall back on past behaviors or to leave. It's not to try something new, right? So what we really want to do, obviously these are the areas that will have the most impact for the business and for the individuals, but we don't want to be committing to just practicing a new behavior in those high stake moments. Instead, what we want to do is we want to look at the foundational situations where we can practice the thing that would apply in a situational environment. I'll give you an example of this. Let's go back to the board meeting thing. Let's say that you've just learned something around how to facilitate a contentious board, and you really want to practice that. Waiting until the next board meeting is not the right time and place to practice that. It's where the muscle memory should kick in, and we want to be executing on the thing that we've already practiced a million times. Think professional athletes, right? They practice at an obscene ratio to gameplay, because gameplay is around executing on the stuff that they've developed over the practice season. It's the exact same thing for us. So when we make a commitment to a behavior change, we don't want it to be something that is weekly or monthly or quarterly or when the situation arrives. What we want to do is we want to look for the foundational elements that fit within that situation, but can also be practiced more regularly. So, contentious board, learning how to facilitate that group, take the pressure out of the situation. Awesome. Instead of mentally committing only to practicing that in the board meeting, what we want to do is look at the pieces that we could practice on a daily basis. Is there something around human dynamics at play? And do you have enough meetings in your week, probably, that you could practice that foundational piece? So instead of when the chairman shoots down the opinion of our new board member, if it was that sort of situation, instead of getting defensive, I will ask one probing question. Maybe that was the example. That's a hyper-specific situation. Let's apply it more generally. So it might be when I'm in a meeting, period, instead of waiting for consensus, I will invite the quietest voice to share input, something like that. That now becomes something foundational. That becomes the act of inviting disparate viewpoints into the conversation. You can practice that 10, 15, 20, 100 times before you get into that board situation with the overbearing chair and you're trying to now include the voices of the newer board members. So the idea here is not to downplay the importance of the situational, but it's to expand out and say, what are the fundamental components of that and how can I practice those on a regular basis? So, as a recap, when you've got people leaving a workshop and they're committed to change, and you've even dialed into a behavior that they can work on, stop and ask yourself, how regularly can they practice that behavior? And if it's less than daily, if it's less than 3 or 4 times a week, I would say is the absolute minimum cutoff, then we want to pause and expand. We want to look for ways to take the element that is almost definitely situational and say, what is the regular foundational layer that we can practice here instead? If you find yourself in a place where the meaning is low for the individual, they're kind of going through the motions, but they're not really into it, there's an opportunity to create more space for meaning. Invite dialogue. Invite them to explore why this might matter. What does the future look like if we practice this? What does the future look like if we don't practice this? Why does that matter to you? These types of questions. We want to move from directed to situational, situational to foundational, or ideally directed right to foundational. The holy grail here is every day, regardless of whether they're at work. What we have found is that meaning almost definitely is tied to commitments that they can practice in their personal life, not just in their work life. Rightly or wrongly, we associate more meaning with our relationship with our spouse, with our kids, with our neighbors, with our church group, with our sports team, whatever the case may be, beyond work. So if we can expand, so the foundational becomes something that is foundational to their life, meaning will naturally go up by extension. And that's how you move from people making great commitments and then having them fizzle to people making commitments that they stick with and see ripple effects across all areas of their life.